Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. Now, one thing that's all that bothered me about the film version is when the orcs have abducted Merry and Pippin and they're carrying them back through Fanghorn to Saruman. And they get into an argument because one group wants to eat Merry and Pippin, at least sample their legs. And the other group wants them to be returned intact to Saruman. So they get into a fight among themselves and they kill some orcs. And then one of the victorious orcs says, "Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys." And I'm thinking, when would orcs ever be looking at a menu? Have they been to Applebee's? I just don't quite get that illusion. So that's another problem I would have to put on the slate of the film version.
Welcome to the Wade podcast. Our previous podcast focused on Sayers and cinema, and we thought it would be interesting now to focus on the film adaptations of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So I am joined by two Tolkien scholars, Laura Schmidt, the archivist at the Wade, who is our supreme leader when it comes to Tolkien studies. She is advisor to the Tolkien Society on Wheaton's campus. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me again.
And David is doing a lot of work on Tolkien, especially in his relationship with C.S. Lewis. So he has done presentations on the film adaptations of Lord of the Rings. Thank you, David, for joining us.
I'm glad to be here. And I would say that Laura is the expert on Tolkien. I'm the opinionated enthusiast.
Okay. I wanted to say a few comments before we started about the whole issue of film adaptation to begin with. Many people automatically assume that the book is always going to be better than the movie. And other people only see the films and never go back to what inspired the films. Obviously, we need what Sayers would call is a delicate balance. And I would like to start by quoting a French filmmaker from the mid-20th century who said, "An honest adaptation is a betrayal." Do either of you want to comment on that idea that an honest adaptation is a betrayal?
I think Laura has something to say on that.
I'm still chewing on that quote, trying to think about what angle to go with.
Okay, I'll comment on it. I've taught courses in film adaptation, and basically what Carlo Rim, this French filmmaker, is suggesting is that novels and films are different mediums. Mm-hmm. And so they present narrative in radically different ways. And any filmmaker who tried to include every single conversation, every single incident, especially from something like Lord of the Rings, in a film, it would be a bad film. Mm-hmm. So you have to betray the original text in order to honor the original text.
Oh, by honest, he means like a scene-by-scene and shot-by-shot adaptation.
Since it would be impossible to put everything from the Lord of the Rings onto the screen, it would seem somewhat ironic when the filmmaker, like Peter Jackson's famous films, adds things that aren't in the original text. Mm-hmm. Can either one of you comment on some of his additions as to whether you think those enhanced the original text because it captured the power or a theme in the text, or did it detract?
Yeah, when you asked me this earlier, I really thought about a good addition, something that enhanced and made the themes come out a little bit stronger. A scene that not everyone loves, but I appreciate, is when the elves show up at Helms Deep, which they do not do in the book, to help with the battle against Saruman and his orc army. basically, we know that Rohan doesn't have enough soldiers. We know that mankind in general has not been on good speaking terms with the elves for a while. There's been a lot of betrayals, a lot of bloodshed. So to have that happen in the film, I thought was touching, to show that the elves were willing to sacrifice themselves and help out some men from Rohan to battle this common enemy. Similarly to the Battle of the Five Armies in The Hobbit, where you have all of the good forces who were formerly fighting just a few pages back come together to defeat the evil presence that has come at the foot of the Lonely Mountain. So although it's not totally faithful to the book, I feel like it keeps with the themes. I think that it shows coming together to fight evil against a common enemy, is germane to Tolkien.
Some people, I like the execution too. The way they marched up was very memorable, the elves. Some of my students, when they read the book, they go, the elves are saying, this is the greatest battle of our time. That's why we want to give you warm clothes and we want to give you bread and give you a light. And so they liked the idea that the elves are more involved in the battle. So I suppose you might say there's a bit of a hunger there to see the elves more involved in this epic battle that we get in the book.
And one thing in The Lord of the Rings that you come away with is, why don't the elves do more? As a reader,
Right.
if you haven't read the Silmarillion, you don't know all of the hundreds of years of battles and bloodshed that's already happened, and they don't seem as active. There's other battles going on off the page that you don't know about. Lothlorien gets attacked during the War of the Ring, which, unless you look in the appendices, you don't realize that. So, to have them come on the screen during the Two Towers to help out Rohan during the Battle of Helms Deep, I thought was an effective addition.
I like the scene in the snow where Boromir wants to use the ring for Gondor. He doesn't want to destroy it. And when they're climbing, Frodo stumbles and the ring comes off in the snow and Boromir picks it up. And Aragorn secretly grabs the hilt of his sword. And then Boromir says, it's such a little thing, I can't figure out how the ring would come off from around Frodo's neck. But it dramatized the tension between Aragorn and Boromir over how to use the ring. I thought that was a clever scene.
It gave you a hint about that character arc with Boromir, which we see that at the Council of Elrond as well. When he says, why don't we just use the ring? This is something that's a weapon. We can use it. So I think little hints by a filmmaker for a character as they develop are helpful too to the audience, so that they don't feel totally off kilter or betrayed when he comes out and tries to take it by force later at the end of the film.
Yeah. Well,
that's
the book,
a great.
I was just going to mention that in the book, Boromir, he's always impetuous. He blows the horn before they leave from Rivendell, which wasn't a good idea. And then he's the one who throws a rock in the pond outside of the Mines of Moria. And Frodo says, "Why did you do that?" In the movie, they changed it to one of the hobbits, didn't they, throwing the rock?
Yeah, I think Merry and Pippin were both tossing rocks.
Yeah, I think they missed a bet there because the idea is that Boromir is a great warrior, but he's really not meant to be a king. He's only the son of stewards, and he's always a little bit too impetuous. So I think they should have kept that element to his personality in the films.
You have captured with this example, especially the ring coming off, falling in the snow, an element of adaptation studies, which assumes that film always needs to externalize the internal. How do we know a person's character? How do we know what a person is thinking? And so many times you need to add a visual scene like the one that you have just mentioned about the ring to get us to understand Boromir's character better. I think I mentioned in an earlier podcast we did when we talked about the movie about Tolkien's life, his early life, that one of the problems in film then is they start having cliches to exteriorize the interior. And one of the common cliches in film is showing someone vomiting to illustrate they're upset about something. So it's a literal exteriorizing of the interior, but it's like a GIF. It's a cliche insofar as most of us have never seen someone who has thrown up because they're upset. It's always because of flu or food poisoning, right? And yet you see it all the times in film. So this incident that you're talking about is so much more subtle, but yet it captures the character arc, as Laura put it. Are there examples you can think of? This goes back to additions that you think are more gratuitous in Lord of the Rings films.
Well, this one was just kind of amusing, but I asked my students once what their favorite passage was in Lord of the Rings. One of them said, when Boromir's dying and he looks at Aragorn, he says, I would have followed you, my brother, my captain, my king. I go, that's not in Lord of the Rings. That's in the film, but it's not in the book. Mm-hmm. But I think I would nominate that for a good one.
A good one, yeah.
Are you talking now about ones that we think
Well, no, we can still continue. We can go either way. Ones that you think are effective or ones that you think are gratuitous.
Something I've noticed in the Jackson films is they kind of vamp up whatever action sequences may or may not have happened in the book. So the run out of Moria away from the Balrog is like all mass chaos, right. With the falling bridge and all of that, which again externalizes the tension of trying to escape and making it extra dramatic, which you might need for audiences to get into the story in that respect. A couple of elements I didn't think were as effective were the warg attack in Two Towers, where Aragorn falls off a cliff and flows down a stream and then shows up later. It's not the worst thing to have in there. It's fine for a dramatic scene, but was it really necessary? And the book didn't have it. Yes, it was a perilous journey to Helms Deep, but you had a battle that was coming up soon enough. Did you need that other action sequence? You could argue, did they need to sell more even star necklaces because that, shows up in his hand later.
Or the filmmakers were thinking of that famous scene from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid where they jump off this cliff into this stream. So many times they are, whether intentionally or not, alluding to effective scenes they remember from their past.
Right.
Well, I think one of the most controversial ones is Jackson obviously wanted to do more with female characters. So in Lord of the Rings, he has Glorfindel's horse, but Frodo has to make his own ride toward Rivendell to try to outpace the Black Riders. And then it's Gandalf who makes the wave with the white horses' heads that sweeps away the Black Riders. In Lord of the Rings movie, Peter Jackson gives Arwen quite a bit more to do. Do you agree with that, doing more with female characters, or do you feel that detracts from the narrative as it's told in the book?
Well, with a gain, you come with a loss as well. And that was one of the disappointments when I first saw The Fellowship of the Ring, because it detracts from Frodo's strength as a character. If he's not able to carry this shard of the Nazgul blade in his shoulder for that journey, how is he going to get all the way to Mordor carrying the ring? Does that really have consistency there with how his character functions? I do recognize that you can't have Arwen show up at the very end to marry one of the leads without having understood that Aragorn was engaged and, she was a character that lived at Rivendell that he knew for a long time. So there's give and take there. What I thought was interesting in the 1978 Ralph Bakshi film is they actually had Legolas replace Glorfindel as the elf that rides up on a horse to help the Fellowship. So they got him into the action a little earlier. I might have been a little bit more pleased with that because Glorfindel's such a minor character. I guess you can argue that he doesn't need to be in a film adaptation. And having Legolas still be an elf and, appropriate because he's going to be introduced later, made part of the Fellowship, that works too. Making Arwen war type was, I think, what rubbed me the wrong way. That doesn't really resonate with her character as I read her in the book. I think that she has a strength, but it doesn't need to be displayed on the battlefield necessarily. They also had her originally in Helm's Deep. You can still see her in one of the background shots from a pan view. She has like a pink or maroon outfit on and she's battling in the background. She was supposed to pull Aragorn up a wall with a rope. They replaced that with Legolas. So even they in the editing process realized she doesn't belong here. We're going to go ahead and take that out, despite the fact we had Liv Tyler battling on the field here for Helm's Deep. So
they do make her more of a warrior like Eowyn rather than a different kind of female. Another cliche of modern movies is female empowerment has to be that you are physically adept at martial arts and beating up people and shooting guns.
Well, and actually, I think of that as being anti-feminist because it is implying that a woman can be strong only if she imitates the activities, the actions of males. And a truly feminist film would show women's strength in non-male ways. So it's still subordinating females to male paradigms. So that's why I would have trouble with adding this military component to the female character. That's not feminist.
I think filmmakers are still trying to figure this out, and I think audiences resonate with certain things that might not be across all of the populace.
Now, I had a student write an interesting paper about Eowyn, and that she wants to prove herself by being a warrior and going out and taking the role of Durnhelm. But she keyed on toward the end of The Lord of the Rings, when she and Faramir have a long conversation about the purpose of war, and she claimed that Eowyn becoming married to Faramir was very important for her character arc, because she understands that she doesn't have to prove her worth by being a warrior. There's this famous quote by Faramir about, "I do not fight for the love of the sword." Do you remember that? The general idea is, I don't like the warrior ethic. I just want to defend my
I fight
homeland.
to protect what it's supposed to be,
right.
Keeping safe, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I always wonder if there's a
quote.
Chesterton quote. He says, "I don't fight because I hate what's in front of me. I fight because I love what's behind me."
Right.
And I always wonder if
nice.
that quote by Faramir was related to that Chesterton idea.
How about the elements that were deleted from the Tolkien movies? And once again, you can't put everything in, but do you have any ideas of elements that Peter Jackson left out that you think he shouldn't have, and that he might have done better to leave something else out?
I had a couple thoughts on this. One of the main things I realized is that I wasn't overly upset about a lot of the things he left out. I think there's more debate about his interpretations of what he left in, or minor changes to those. So I'll just say that at the offset. But the two examples I had, one that I think was a wise decision was Tom Bombadil does not appear. Tom Bombadil has not appeared in any Tolkien adaptation to date.
Wow.
Unless
Interesting.
it's an unabridged audiobook. Now, Tolkien fans have been hungry to see him on the screen, but if you look at how that episode functions in the narrative of the story, it's a big detour. You literally go off the old, west or eastbound road, go through the old forest, go through the Barrow Downs, and pick back up exactly where you left off and continue to Bree. As a filmmaker, that's an easy episode to leave out because it doesn't keep your characters moving in the arc of the story or the plot. So I think ultimately was a wise decision. Would we have loved to have seen Tom Bombadil? Absolutely. But maybe another time when we have the luxury of a 50-hour television series or something like
Which
that.
is a different medium altogether. So you can include more episodes if you have a television series that can go on for years.
Right. And Jackson made the point in the audio tracks that go along with the film, we had to get our characters on the road into Bree as quickly as possible. So a lot of that beginning part of the book was condensed or left out. And I can understand from a visual perspective and storytelling art form that needed to happen. So Tom Bombadil was left out.
The only part I missed from that, I agree that subplot could... Peter Jackson said that the basic story was Frodo's got to destroy the ring, and if it didn't forward that storyline, it probably was deletable. The only part, I loved it in The Lord of the Rings, where when they find the swords that the Barrow-wights have been collecting,
right,
they were made by elves or men of the north, and that's the one sword that can kill Angmar later on when he becomes the Lord of the Ring wraiths. I love that plot detail.
Yeah.
And you had to sacrifice that.
Yeah. It's not essential to the visual storytelling, but it's great when you can dig deeper and find that in the literature.
It gives you that feeling of this providence overriding the world of Middle Earth.
Yeah. You'd also have the problem of, hey, the ring doesn't impact Tom, but yet we have Faramir and Galadriel and Gandalf falling all over themselves. How do you deal with that when you're a filmmaker as well?
That's right.
That's a nice thing to probably avoid.
Yeah.
The scene that I think some of fans might have been disappointed that didn't turn up that maybe could have was the scouring of the Shire at the end of Return of the King. The hobbits go back in the films and the Shire is still the idyllic, peaceful place it was when they left. But in the books, we discover Saruman has gone back. He's basically destroyed their homeland. And Merry mentions this in the Two Towers movie. He says the Shire's going to burn, if we don't stop this evil here and now, Pippin. We can't just go home and pretend it doesn't happen. But they don't fulfill that in the films. Now, they had limited time to wrap everything up, and people have critiqued these films as already having half a dozen endings already at The Return of the King, because there is so much to wrap up. They probably just didn't have the stamina to keep that going and show the Scouring of the Shire scene. But at the same time, you have to wonder, with Tolkien's way of showing it, is that an element of the story that needed to be mentioned?
I wonder if in a book you can have a gentle, they talk about anticlimactic moments. And once Sauron has been destroyed and all his fortresses have come tumbling down, in a book, I think you can have a gentler anticlimax, or you can kind of resolve the story more slowly. I think it would be harder in a film after you've seen these dramatic collapse of the entire Sauron empire to go on with several more episodes.
Right.
So I think sometimes something works in a book that doesn't work in a film and vice versa. So once again, you can't have a scene-by-scene or a shot-by-shot adaptation. Crystal, you brought up the idea of doing it as a TV episode. As we know, the Narnia series has been sold to Netflix for a massive sum. And the not Lord of the Rings, but Middle-earth franchise is going to Amazon Prime. I heard a figure like $250 million.
I think the rights were sold for $250 million. It's got $1 billion budget, and they've, last time I heard, committed to 5 seasons of whatever this show is going to be. So, yeah.
And that relates to my question. First of all, if you're listening to this podcast and you know the producers, please take our insights and try to apply them to the next generation of, wouldn't you agree? But isn't the Middle-earth episode going to be a prequel?
I thought you were going to say, please ask them to donate some of their millions to the Wade.
Yes, we'd also accept that. But the question comes up, is it better these days with outlets like Netflix to have something that could be more thorough and can go over several seasons? I don't know if you saw the Breaking Bad movie, but it was okay, but it didn't have nearly the impact as the long series.
I wouldn't say it was better. It's a different medium. So when you're talking about the medium of a film that is shown either in theaters or now Netflix is showing a lot of films, but a film is a different presentation than a series. So yes, an episodic edition of the Tolkien novels can do more because they have years to do it.
So I got to the Tom Bombadil episode, I could just skip it.
Well, that'll be interesting to see if they include Tom Bombadil.
Well, the Amazon series is supposed to take place during the Second Age. So really, we're going to be going with a lot of what I'm guessing will be original storytelling that's based on chronologies rather than actual narrative text. So we'll have to see how that transpires.
So it's not an adaptation at all.
To the best of my knowledge, not. We don't know a lot about it yet. I don't know if they're going to make it to the Third Age and cover any ground that is in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. But to the best of my knowledge right now, it's Second Age only. So,
this is interesting because in Lord of the Rings, you're dealing with such a strong property. So many of the best lines of dialogue come directly from Tolkien. It'll be interesting to see if they're up to the task of just taking a plot line or a narrative arc and actually doing justice to the dialogue and the description. I wanted to go back earlier to the films versus books. And there's some things that films don't. You can leave out Tom Bombadil, that's a choice. But often you can't capture prose style. And when people say, oh, I saw the movie, so I don't need to read the book.
Right.
I was just thinking of a scene in Bree when they're first talking to Aragorn. They don't know who he is yet. He's just Strider. And they don't know who the Black Riders are. And I wanted to read a brief passage to talk about Tolkien's prose style. This is the kind of thing you can't capture with a camera. He warns them that they'll let you go out at night, and but then they'll ambush you in the dark. And he says, "Do you wish them to find you? They are terrible." The hobbits looked at him and saw with surprise that his face was drawn as if with pain, and his hands clenched the arms of his chair. The room was very quiet and still, and the light seemed to have grown dim. For a while he sat with unseeing eyes, as if walking in distant memory, or listening to sounds in the night far away. "There," he cried after a moment, drawing his hand across his brow. "Perhaps I know about these pursuers more than you do. You fear them, but you do not fear them enough." And I just love that prose, and I love the metaphors of walking in the night and memory. And you really can't do that with a camera.
And that's describing Strider with the hobbits at Bree in the Fellowship of the Ring. Yeah. Yeah, Tolkien's prose is amazing. And because he knows language so well, he also I see this again and again when I go back to his books. He uses the exact right
he
word
does.
at the right time to describe whatever it is. And his setting description is second to none in literature, period. It's amazing.
So you can do a wonderful job with the camera, but you still don't get that feeling of... Another one of my favorites that you couldn't put with a camera is when Sam is having second thoughts about going on this expedition with the Fellowship. And he turns to the pony Bill and he says, Bill, you shouldn't have come. You could have eaten the best hay until the new grass comes in. And it says, Bill swished his tail and said nothing. And it's very funny in prose, but you couldn't capture that with the camera. So part of it is not conscious choices of the director. Part of it's just things that film can't do that books can do.
Well, and trying to theorize this, the filmmakers in the French New Wave talked about the camera stylo, by which they meant the camera pen. In other words, the writer of a novel writes with the stylo, the pen, and puts the art into the prose itself, whereas film, you write with the camera. And in both mediums, people miss the true art when they reduce it all to story. Like what you just read, David, that just enriches. It's not just about the story, it's about the way Tolkien can so beautifully capture a narrative detail and give metaphor. And the same with film. It's not just about story. It's about the artistry of the camera stylo, how it captures story visually.
And there's a lot of different layers because you have the different cameras in play. You have the editing decisions made. You have the soundtrack. You have the sound effects. You have the way the actors are portraying things and the way the director has actually set the scene. So that's a lot under one stylo to navigate.
Oh, that is exactly right.
Well, I think my opposite example from the scene that I just read is when they light the signal fires from Gondor to let them know they're under siege. It's only a few sentences with several names of mountain peaks in Lord of the Rings, but when you see it in The Return of the King, it's really a glorious scene where you can see a mountain in the distance, the flame coming up, and then all these drone shots, or I don't know if they're drone or helicopter shots, but it's really a glorious scene that when you read it in Lord of the Rings, it doesn't stand out.
And there will be few fans who will say, I don't like that addition to the film because it's so good. And I remember Jackson talking in the audio track about what these lives of these caretakers for the different beacons must be like living on top of a mountain where, I mean, I don't even know if there's enough oxygen for someone to survive up there. They're just waiting for the day, training their child and when they might need to light the beacon, you know. But I don't want to think too rationally about that because it's beautiful and it's dramatic and, you know, it's a really fun part of the film. So
Do you have any other examples from Lord of the Rings?
Well, I wanted to ask Laura, one time we were talking, you said that you thought there were some unforgivable sins in Lord of the Rings. Yeah. And one of them was what they did with Faramir.
Yeah.
So say something about the literary interpretation of his character, which disappointed you.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, I do remember being very disappointed when I first saw the theatrical cut of Two Towers because specifically of how they treated Faramir's character. The extended edition does make it a bit better. You get some more context to see how he was treated by his father, how his father favored his brother. So we didn't have that when we first saw the theatrical cut. Faramir is a character who is a secondary character in the Lord of the Rings books, but he just has a different level of morality, of respectability, of humility that is wonderful to see. And his engagement with the hobbits when they come to Ithilien and the way that he handles the decision-making process of what to do with this ring bearer, knowing what he knows about the situation in Gondor, his father's expectations. It's a hard thing to sell in the movie, especially when the ring's temptation has been exaggerated. We see Galadriel turn into, scary Frankenstein bride or something. I don't know in that moment. And so to have a secondary character walk on the screen and say, I would not touch that thing if it was lying by the road. It's hard to justify that in the film. So I think they almost dug themselves into a hole with him where they said, well, he can't be this virtuous because that's not a character arc that shows well on the screen. And these great other people in Middle-earth are too tempted by the ring. How could he not be? Yet in the book, because of the choices he's made as a character up to that point, he has the strength of character to turn down the temptation of the ring and to say, I'm going to help you on this journey because I recognize what your task is actually bigger than our concerns in Gondor right now. He makes that decision.
Right. And he's the character that Tolkien himself most identified with. Tolkien said in a letter that I identified most with Faramir except for his courage.
Wow.
But it's in the book, it's such a wonderful literary foil because you think, oh no, here's Boromir 2.0, but actually he's very different from Boromir. He understands the way Aragorn understands. And in the movie, I think, I agree with you, they sort of dropped the ball by making him more or less a chip off the old block like like Boromir was.
And they describe him as having more of the blood of Numenor, and I don't want to get into genetics too much here, but it's something that Tolkien uses in his characterization for both Aragorn and for Faramir, and saying that bloodline and the nobleness of that bloodline does show up and is, in a sense, a pure or a more humble exemplar as a character, if that makes any sense. Denethor and Boromir had this lust for battle, for power, all of these things that Faramir didn't have as much of that. Right. So I think that's partly choice. I think it's also Tolkien saying this true strain from Numenor and the virtue that it has embodied itself in him.
So it's a recessive gene in Numenor, is what you're saying?
I don't know exactly how to explain that, but yeah.
Well, David and Laura, do you have any other additions or deletions that you want to mention that either improved or detracted from the Lord of the Rings films?
There were some scenes with Elrond where he almost seemed evil. Now, the trouble is I remember that actor from The Matrix.
Right. A lot of people do.
Yeah, I think that was a bad casting choice. It should have been
I think of
face.
Elrond Hubbard, so that's not a positive association.
But they include some odd scenes where he seemed morally ambiguous, and I didn't pick that up at all from the book.
He's a sterner portrayal of the character, I would say. Yeah, I don't know if that's the exact portrayal that I would have picked for Elrond either, but it didn't bother me to the point of being a distraction, I would say either.
Do you have a theory as to why the change?
I don't. I don't know what direction he received or what his acting style is like that made him decide to portray Elrond in that way. One other thing that I will mention, which was the only unforgivable sin that hasn't been brought up yet, is Frodo and Sam's relationship in The Return of the King. They chose to add a lot more psychological tension and actually have a breaking of their friendship where Frodo sends Sam home in the movie, and that is just so contrary to how the relationship functioned in the book. And really that is the heart of what this quest is all about, is the strength of their friendship and getting one another through this really challenging quest. So that was the one, even more so than Faramir's character, that bothered me the most out of the Jackson films. And I think that they were trying to have Smeagol/Gollum be this lever to kind of wedge them apart and have all this psychological drama and, oh no, the quest is falling apart. What do you think will happen? But I think you could have had a dramatic story and kept that friendship intact without having all of that added tension.
Yes, that's one of the unfortunate cliches in film where we see so much exploration of romantic love and not enough of the love of true friendship or the love of parent for child. And there are certain fantastic films that focus on that, but I think you've made a great point there, Laura. Any last comments from you, David?
I was going to mention other adaptations. The 1978 version you mentioned by Ralph Bakshi, which is very strange. It's rotoscoped, so some of it looks like animation and some of it looks like live
They actually
characters.
filmed scenes and then did the animation on top of the filmed scenes with live actors. Yeah, and that was big stuff back in the day.
Yeah.
In defense of Bakshi, I will say that that is the only film we had before the Jackson movies came out, and they use so much text from the books. So I have been gifted by the adaptation in that I have been helped to memorize a lot of text straight out of the books because I watched that film over and over again. And it does not continue into the end of The Lord of the Rings. It actually stops halfway through Two Towers, right after the Battle of Helms Deep. There were supposed to be 2 films. They did not get the funding for the second one. Some people might say lamentably, others might say blessedly. But I know when I first watched it, I was just horrified because I was expecting to see this whole drama unfold and just was enraged that I didn't have the rest of the story to see.
Well, it's some comfort. In 1980, Rankin Bass came out with an animated version.
They did.
Which has singing orcs. So if you would like to see singing orcs, see
When
the
there's a
1980.
whip, there's a way.
Exactly.
Classic. Classic.
There's a way. Where there's a whip. There's a way. I think we've gone far enough.
I can't get it out of my mind. I saw it decades ago.
You know, for orcs, they have a great tenor section. It's really, it is catchy music.
There's some fun cover songs of that as well out there too.
I can imagine.
And Legolas and Gimli don't actually appear in that film at all. So speaking of questionable
that's true.
redactions of the literary text, they don't show up at all.
I hadn't thought of that. Now, one thing that bothered me about the film version is when the orcs have abducted Merry and Pippin and they're carrying them back through Fanghorn to Saruman, and they get into an argument because one group wants to eat Merry and Pippin, at least sample their legs, and the other group wants them to be returned intact to Saruman. So they get into a fight among themselves and they kill some orcs. And then one of the victorious orcs says, "Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys." And I'm thinking, when would orcs ever be looking at a menu? Have they been to Applebee's? I just don't quite get that illusion. So that's another problem I would have to put on the slate of the film version.
Well, speaking of menus, I hope that people who have been listening to our podcasts look back at our menu of the various conversations we've had in the month of January about film and its relationship to our authors. Thank you, my friend Laura, and my even longer-term friend David, for joining us together to talk about Lord of the Rings.